If you've been paying attention to the Ottawa real estate market headlines, you've probably realized that the headlines don't necessarily reflect what's going on in your individual neighborhood. That's definitely the case for Orleans, and it's the case for a lot of other neighborhoods around the city. That's what I'm trying to remedy with this video series that I'm doing, and today we're going to look at what's happening in Orleans specifically. So if you're curious about whether or not prices and sales volumes in Orleans have been keeping up with Ottawa, you are in the right place. Today, we're going to talk about what's been going on in the freehold market and the condo market and what that could mean for you heading into 2026, because depending on the sort of property that you're buying or selling, the advice could be very different if you want to avoid making a mistake. I'm not going to go into individual neighborhoods in Orleans here, but if you have any questions about a specific street or a specific type of property in Orleans, don't hesitate to shoot me a message. I'd be happy to get you that information as well. So the first number I think it's important to look at is the total number of new listings that came up in Orleans. Now, this is the number of properties that hit the market on the MLS system. Now, the first thing to note about this number is that there was listed on the MLS and then taken down and relisted at a lower price, which is a pretty common practice when you're lowering your price if you're trying to sell, is going to be double counted here. And there's no way to back that information out. I would estimate in reality, probably somewhere between 26 and 2,800 is the actual number of new listings. There's no way to know for sure. And what we're going to compare that to is the number of total sales, where there's no double counting going on. So just shy of 2,000 sales happened in Orleans, and this is both condos and freehold properties. So what we can take away from this data is around 3/4 to 4/5 of the listings that came up in the market in Orleans did end up selling eventually. And if you look at my general Ottawa market update, you'll realize that this is actually better than the rest of the city. The rest of the city, we're looking at like just over half of the listings that actually sold when compared to the number of listings that hit the market. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the main ones is much like Kanata and Barrhaven, a lot of the Orleans market is made up of freehold properties and townhouse condos, which have really outperformed the condo apartment units more prevalent in the central part of the city. As far as sales volume, we're going to start by looking at the freehold properties. So the orange dashed line is the 2024 sales volumes, and the bar graph is 2025. And we can see here for the majority of the year, other than that weird month in February, and then in November and December, which are always a little bit weird because of the small number of sales that happen, we actually outperformed in 2024 as far as freehold sales in Orleans. Especially in the spring market, May was a banger of a month for Orleans freeholds. So we tracked pretty closely to 2024 for most of the year, with the real notable exception in May. So we actually did better for sales volume year over year. In Orleans condos, which there's a relatively small amount of, so there's going to be a little bit of volatility in the data here. We saw a pretty steady seasonal increase in number of sales that happened. March, April, May were kind of the highest months. 2024 in May, looks like was really good for condos, but stuck relatively close together and fell off a little bit at the end of the year, except for December, where there were a few more condo sales in 2025. Now, this is a chart that I look at least once a year because it gives us a really good idea of what the general profile of the market is. And in Orleans, we can see, much like Kanata and Barrhaven, a lot of detached and townhouse properties. That makes up the vast majority of the market. We've got a relatively small amount of condo apartments and condo townhouses. And I find it's useful to keep this in mind when we also look at this chart here, which breaks down the same sales volume number by price point. So we can kind of glean from this that the average property in Orleans is probably going to be a detached or a townhouse, and it's probably going to fall somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000, generally speaking. We've got a lot of bigger detached properties that kind of get up to and over $1 million in those newer neighborhoods. And we've got some smaller ones. These lower numbers here are going to be made up of the condo townhouses and condo apartments. But generally speaking, the average place in Orleans is going to be that sort of property that we mentioned in this price point here. Now, months of inventory is one of my favorite stats to look at when I'm looking at real estate data because I think it's a really good leading indicator as to where prices are going. Months of inventory very quickly is the number of properties that were on the market at the end of the month, the number of listings that were sitting there, divided by the rate at which properties sold in that same period. And what that gives us is a measure of absorption. How long would it take if we were to stop selling properties right at the end of the month to completely run out of properties if we sold it at the rate that properties sold in that period. So the higher the months of inventory, the slower that section of the market is going. It means there's probably an elevated supply or a decreased demand if the number goes up. Anything above 6 months is considered a buyer's market. Anything from 4 to 6 months is considered a balanced market, and anything below 4 is considered technically a seller's market. So you can see we started and finished the year in seller's market territory for both condos and freeholds. And weirdly enough, in December, I'm going to chalk this up to low sample size and just kind of wonky numbers that happen at the end of the year. But we see that condos actually had a lower months of inventory at 3.818 compared to 3.53 for freeholds. I would expect this to reverse. As you can see, for kind of most of the year here, condo months of inventory was higher than freeholds, which is kind of where we'd expect things to be. But this is a much tighter spread than what we saw in markets like Kanata and in the Ottawa market in general. In most of the market, condos were much, much higher as far as months of an inventory, specifically apartment condos. Sales to list price ratio is another one that I like to look at. The dashed line is condos, the blue line is freeholds, and this is basically how much off the asking price the average house is selling for. Now, one thing to note about this stat is this is the final asking price that we're talking about. So if a place was listed at $550, for example, then they price dropped to $500 and it sold for $475, then it's going to be the $500 related to the $475 that gives us the list to sold price ratio. It doesn't take into consideration the price drops that they needed to do in order to get there, which is unfortunate, but it's the best we can do. And we can see here it stayed pretty stable in the freehold market. It was 98 up to 99 for most of the year, back down to 98, and then it kind of bounced back and forth, finishing at 98 at the end of the year. The condo market also started and ended at 98, but it dipped a little bit lower towards the end of the year. So we can see that most people for both a freehold and a condo are getting a little bit off the asking price, not too many going over the asking price, which was kind of the norm a few years ago. Getting into average prices now, looking at freeholds, the average price increased by 1.8% for a freehold property. We can see we had kind of a traditional market here. We had kind of quieter prices in January, quite low actually in January. And then we had increases as we moved into the spring and summer market. The traditional kind of slowdown in July resulted in slightly lower prices before the prices climbed a little bit again and then fell for the remainder of the year. For condominiums, we can see we had a bit of a weird year in 2024. Prices went really high at the end of the year, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There was probably just a few outlier properties that sold at the end of the year. We started at 409, ended the year at 3.95. So we saw a 3.2% decrease in the average condo price in Orleans in 2025. Again, a pretty traditional market where it climbed a little bit in the spring and then fell towards the end of the year. So Orleans overall has been a pretty stable market this year, and this is not too surprising given that it's mostly made up of those freehold properties. It's definitely softening as we head into 2026, and I think the biggest evidence of that is the months of inventory number, which has started to creep up in both sectors, but it's not nearly as bad as some other sections of the city and some other property types. If you're looking to sell an apartment condo, it's going to be a really different experience than if you're trying to sell a freehold property. As always, if you have any questions about this stuff, don't hesitate to reach out. Wish you all the best in 2026 and talk to you next month. Cheers.